That is it. We're live. So I'm here again with Mark Brahman, and as we mentioned, we're going to be doing these a little more regularly now. And one of the things we wanted to talk about today, and probably ongoing, is just taking some of the classic Greek myths and sort of dissecting them. Deciding what they were really trying to say, looking at what sort of wisdom or information they were trying to impart, and just taking, I guess you would say, non-traditional or just more thoughtful looks into some of these myths. And the one we want to talk about today is the myth of Typhon and his battle with Zeus. Any immediate thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you want, I can just dive in. I think we'll go for like an hour. What do you think, Rick? Is that
Yeah, I think we're good for an hour.
yeah.
And just to sort of lay out the table with my own kind of layman's thought and impression of the myth. For one thing, I think it's very interesting. If we first look at Cronus, right, or Saturn, he's sort of a more, in a way, he's kind of a more deceptive figure. He's essentially sort of a father figure who's then eating his children, right? So there's a level of trust there, and he's slowly consuming the children and the people as a resource. And then that is the first big challenge, the first major challenge that Zeus has to deal with. But then when we see Typhon is a lot less subtle, a lot more on the nose. He is a creature, essentially a golem almost, designed to not be subtle at all, to just straight up say, look, we're taking this back. We're overthrowing the Olympians. This is about us, right? And he has a lot of characteristics, that are almost, you could perceive them, I guess, as Semitic in a way. He speaks multiple languages. He has, 100 snake heads. So it really is a fascinating myth. And yeah, go ahead, jump into it. And like I said, those are just kind of my initial impressions and my layman's thoughts. And I'd be curious to see how you perceive it.
Yeah, no, he is. Well, so Typhon is one of the primary adversaries or arch enemies of Jupiter, and I think, as you were saying before we got on the call, he's sort of a kind of a second attack or a second manifestation of Saturn, who Saturn is overcome by Jupiter. Jupiter becomes king of the gods by overcoming Saturn. And then ostensibly, there's this later opponent, Typhon, who Jupiter also overcomes and throws down and imprisons in Tartarus. And but he's considered kind of the greatest sort of opponent or greatest threat to Jupiter or Zeus. So his arch enemy, if you could say. So if Batman's arch enemy is the Joker, Typhon's is the arch enemy of Jupiter. I mean, what would be another? Lex Luthor is the arch enemy of Superman. So he's the archetypal adversary of Jupiter, Typhon. And Typhon, uh, the Typhon in the ancient world was related very early on and very clearly with Seth or Set, an Egyptian god that was the the primary god of the Hyksos in Egypt, which is very interesting and important, I think, to understanding who Typhon is. Now, of course, the Hyksos, of course, were identified by the ancient historians and ancient mythographers with the ancient Israelites, right? So we could say that the ancient Israelites and the Hyksos, we're talking about the same group. In fact, I would say Hyksos is another way of pronouncing it, which is probably the correct way. So I'll try to remember to do that. But Hyksos. So the Hyksos are the equivalent group of the ancient Israelites, and the mythographers identified them as such. So I make the argument that the Hyksos represent essentially a kind of proto-Jewish group, or it might be more accurate to say that they are a group kind of governed by proto-Jews, by a priest class that is essentially proto-Jewish. In this case, the name of the deity is Seth or Set. It's an Egyptian god that's the equivalent of Typhon. I make the argument that Seth, who's the son of Adam, or is the third son of Adam in the Hebrew Bible, is his name is cognate essentially with Seth, and it represents the same figure effectively. So Seth in the Hebrew Bible, I make the argument, is the same as Seth, um, Typhon in the Egyptian and Greek myth. In any case, so the what's interesting here is that Typhon again is this kind of primary opponent. He's identified with serpents. In Seth, his equivalent in Egypt was identified with jackals. There's a very interesting word in the Hebrew, Tana, and maybe also tannin says this as well. But
Mhm.
Tana in Hebrew means both jackal and dragon. So this might actually be, amazingly enough, this might actually be another kind of synonym of Seth-Typhon. It might be the equivalent of Seth-Typhon, what's being described with this word that means dragon and jackal. Because, of course, Seth Typhon in Egypt was represented by a jackal, a jackal-headed god. It's kind of this
Right.
demonic underworld being. But among the Greeks, he was especially identified with serpents, right? And he was also, his father in the Egyptian pantheon was named Seb, who was known as the father of serpents. Seb was identified with Saturn, and Saturn is often considered to be the father of Typhon Seth. Now, uh, there are other versions of the story. I think Homer gives Tartarus. Tartarus is usually understood as a a place like Hades, an underworld, but like the sort of the deepest and worst part of the underworld, right? Tartarus.
Right.
And sometimes he's considered the son of Tartarus. So Tartarus is, in that case, is made to be a person or a deity. It's one of the few cases in which he is. Um, and 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 then the mother would be Gaia or Terra in that case. But
Right.
commonly, he's given the ancestry of Saturn as being his father. Um,
Now, because of his description, like I say, his description is so sort of on the nose. Would you say this is an Aryan creation?
Who? Typhon? No, Typhon is definitely a. Well, he identifies a proto-Jewish.
Yeah,
Are
he
you?
he he
You're arguing?
identifies a proto-Jewish, but would you say that the myth was built or created by Aryans?
I mean, that seems like a strong possibility, doesn't it? Just because it's not a very flattering description, is it?
Yeah,
Right.
and like I say, there just doesn't seem to be as much subtlety. I mean, his description, for one thing, is just really over the top. Like he's just immense. He's, as tall as the sky essentially, and he has scales and like the whole serpent thing. Are there any connections or cognates in the name Typhon?
No, but maybe there are. I mean, so in other words, I think that the word is derived. There is an etymology, of course, to it, and I think the etymology is it comes from Greek words meaning whirlwind is one possibility. Um, so it's and I don't remember all the possible etymologies right now, but that is one possible etymology, whirlwind. These are also descriptions also that are given to the Hebrew God, right? I mean, I think
Mhm.
one interesting aspect. I mean, one thing he shares in common with Jupiter is that he's a god of storms, right?
Right.
And he's a god of I don't you couldn't call him a celestial god. He's definitely a kind of chthonic god. He's not a god of the heavens, but he's a god who can command winds, but especially sea squalls and hurricanes and typhoons, right? We
Right.
get the name, we get the word typhoon from Typhon, right? So he's also a god of winds. He can control winds or command winds. So he shares that ostensibly he shares that in common with Jupiter, who is also a storm god. But Jupiter's sort of more consistent manifestation, I would argue, is as a diurnal god, so a god of the day. And you could even say of clear skies, arguably, though he definitely has that storm element. He famously throws the lightning bolts and this sort of thing. But that he is like his name, the name itself, the etymology of the name itself means light and is cognate with day, words meaning day and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So he is ultimately a kind of diurnal god in contrast to Typhon, who's a dark god of dark storms and of hurricanes and of sea storms in particular. I think he has a strong connection to the ocean in particular.
As a connection with Vulcan as well, no?
He does have a connection with Vulcan. What were you thinking of in particular, though? Were you?
Well, wasn't he? Man, I don't know the myth completely by heart, but wasn't he buried beneath a volcano? Or I know there's some sort of some element of volcanoes.
Yeah, the Mount Etna, right? So Mount Etna, and where is Mount Etna again? Let me just look briefly. I think it's in Sicily. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mount Etna is associated with both. I mean, I guess we can call them both deities. Typhon, you might class more of it as a titan, but Vulcan, we can call a deity. He was ultimately he would be included among the pantheon of the Olympians, but he is this sort of proto-Jewish god, similar to Typhon in that regard. Yeah, so they both are connected to volcanoes. So that's really kind of the clearest connection between Typhon and Vulcan is that they're both connected to volcanoes, and the volcano becomes one of these symbols. But I would say especially through fire, the symbol of fire. So Hephaestus and Vulcan, the same deity. Vulcan is the Roman name. Hephaestus is the Greek name. But the element of fire, and I've probably said this several times. I mean, it's not just that Hephaestus is a fire god. It's that his name was a kind of synonym of fire in a lot of ways. So his manifestation was often one just of fire, right? We have this image of Vulcan working at that forge, and that's also a useful image because he was also a god of artisans. He was a god of stonemasons. He was a god of sculptors. He was a god of artisans essentially. Um, so he has that aspect as well. But he himself was understood manifest in fire, very similar to Yahweh. Yahweh also has this
Hmm.
aspect where he's often described as being, represented by fire, for example. Now, where Yahweh also gains a reputation as a volcano god, which is something that mythographers have identified. Freud was one of the people that kind of admitted or pointed out that Yahweh was also a volcano god. Is at Mount Sinai, right? So at Mount Sinai, there's a kind of a uh, famous episode at Mount Sinai, and this is ultimately where they derive the Ten Commandments. And there's a scene at the foot of Mount Sinai where they're worshiping a golden god. This whole like kind of important part of Exodus. That scene at Mount Sinai, when you read the descriptions, it's Vulcan, it's Hephaestus. Like it's essentially describing Hephaestus, or at least from my perspective or my understanding. But you could also argue that it's also describing Typhon, right? So they're similar
Hmm.
in that way. Mount Etna was connected to both deities. So Mount Etna in Sicily was understood both as the forge of Vulcan and also buried beneath it, imprisoned beneath it, was Typhon, right? One
Right.
of the myths has Typhon being buried beneath that. That becomes an explanation as to why it's a volcano, right? There's two explanations there. It's because it's
Hmm.
Vulcan's forge, and because there's a fire-breathing dragon or serpent beast beneath it, Typhon, who's fueling that volcano, right? So they are
Right.
connected in that way, and there are other ways in which they're connected too. And you could even, I would argue, you could even make the argument that Typhon is a kind of evil twin of Vulcan, or a kind of, they're ultimately end up to be kind of synonyms on some level. Um, but one of the reasons in which they're similar is that both are understood by various myths and kind of salient canonical myths, you could argue, to be descended of Juno, but descended of Juno where Jupiter is not the father. So she ostensibly has the child by herself. In one case, or actually, I think in both cases, it might be understood as an act of revenge because Jupiter had Minerva by himself. This is sort of the exoteric argument that Juno is making, is that because Jupiter had Athena or Minerva by himself, Juno becomes jealous and wants to have a child by herself, right? Through a kind of uh,
Yeah.
uh,
That, sorry.
miraculous conception, as it were. Oh, please.
Well, yeah, I was going to say it's that's one of the things that I found really interesting, actually, is that once again we have sort of this element of you know, female betrayal, right? You know, that's just constantly a theme, and especially as involves Aryans. It seems that there's almost an obsession with subverting the Aryan female, and having her betray, whether Adam, I guess, in the Bible, or Jupiter as well in this instance, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's just to go on a little tangent here. I mean, I actually tweeted about this recently. I think that and Nietzsche makes a remark on this, which I think is it requires some context, but the upshot is essentially correct, or at least he was onto something that was pretty good. And his idea, or he says at some point that in Semitic myth, sin lies with the woman. In Aryan myth, sin lies with the man. Right
Hmm.
now, and I think it needs a little more. You kind of need to dig down and sort of imagine what he's thinking, or at least examine the question or the idea itself. And so, but I mean, the most obvious example, and probably the example he was thinking of, I don't remember if he actually cites it directly, but the obvious example is Eve in the Garden of Eden, right?
Right.
So Eve in the Garden of Eden, sin. Now we know that this is a Semitic myth in terms of authorship, right? Now, I
Yeah.
make the argument that the characters in the Garden of Eden are not necessarily Jews or Semitic themselves. In fact, I argue that they're not, with the exception of Yahweh and the serpent. I think that those are Semitic figures, but Adam and Eve are intended as Aryans, and there's reasons to believe that are etymological and narrative that we can go into later, or you can just take my word for it for now, so I can make this simple point. But accepting that premise that Adam is an Aryan, Adam, his name the name the he and I'll just go briefly into some of the evidence here, but Edom is the same word as Adam, right?
Hmm.
If you listen to Adam Green, I think has talked about this or made this point before, that the Edomites represent Aryans, right? They in fact in the rabbinical writings, Edom and Rome are the same. They're understood as synonyms, right? So Edom in the West are synonyms. And Edom is descended from Esau. Esau is very famously a Aryan character contrasted with Jacob, who's kind of the proto-Jewish character who who steals the birthright of Esau. And so so Adam is the same as Edom is the same as Esau. These are all synonyms, and this is indicated through a reading of the Hebrew Bible and a kind of sober analysis or look at that document. So Adam is an Aryan figure. Eve is taken from Adam, and there's reasons to believe through her name even that she suggests an Aryan figure. But I think her name in the Hebrew means life ultimately, if I'm remembering correctly. But she's like split from Adam, and I think that there is something subversive going on there as well. That Yahweh is actually splitting Aryan man from Aryan woman. That's the
Hmm.
argument I make.
Right.
And Adam, because in the Hebrew reveals this as well, because in the Hebrew, Adama means earth, right? So there's this idea, and this was also true in the Greek as well. There's this idea that, and Gaia would be an example of this as well, but there's this idea that the earth becomes a symbol for kind of local inhabitants, but particularly arable, like arable earth becomes a symbol for local inhabitants. So the word in the Greek, G, which is so Guy is a poetic form of G. G is means earth, but it also means mankind, inhabitants. Right. So I think you understand. So there's a metaphor for the earth or the humans being the same
Hmm.
as the earth, being of the earth, as it were. And
Yeah.
so Adam is formed from the earth by Yahweh, from the dust, but he exists as something before that. So he's, in a way, he exists as the local inhabitants, as the G. So he's reformed by Yahweh, right? He's reformed by Yahweh on that seventh day, and then he's split in two, one half being uh, Eve. So I argue in her name means life, and there's the rib could have some phallic association, similar to Venus being taken from Uranus. Whole thing. Uh, but so I make the argument that there is something subversive going on there. But regardless, in which is kind of more well known and more accepted. Eve, sin lies with Eve. So in other words, the serpent convinces Eve to commit the sin. And I recently was talking about this on Twitter, and I said, well, actually, sin is, sin with sin. There's also a suggestion of power and responsibility, right?
Right.
So maybe the problem was that Adam didn't sin in the sense that maybe, like Adam in the way that Apollo kills the serpent at Delphi, maybe Adam should have sinned and killed, or sinned with quotation marks around it, accepted power and freedom and dominance, and asserted himself by slaying the serpent, right? So,
Mhm.
so I think, so to get back to Nietzsche's point, sin, with the Aryans, sin does rest with the man in the sense that also responsibility and power rests with the man, right?
Right.
So,
And
yeah,
I think one thing that's interesting in the myth of Typhon too is, where it diverges in that respect, is that Juno redeems herself. She contributes to that betrayal, but then she warns him of Typhon.
say that again. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say one point of difference in the myth of Typhon is that Hera, or Juno, redeems herself. Like, she commits this sort of act of betrayal, right, in the creation of Typhon, but then she warns Zeus that he's coming, right? So there is some redemption there, which you don't see in like the case of Adam and Eve, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's no, but you can also see why some of these myths have a kind of subversive aspect to them, regardless, right?
Well, for sure, yeah.
So that but they also, even when they're subversive, or they seem to be subversive, there's also a lot of like kind of knowledge or information there that we can learn from, right? And I think that this is also true of the Hebrew Bible too. Just as, like, I think that the discussion that we just had about Eden, there's a lot of insight there. Like, I think that we learn a lot about ourselves, but we also learn a lot about Jews through the analysis of myths. That even the New Testament, for example, I think that there's a lot to be learned there, both about them and ourselves. So I think that really the key is developing a lens, through Roman interpretation, for example, developing the ability to analyze and understand what's being said in these myths, and then they become very valuable to us. But yeah, I mean, what is implied with uh, Juno being the mother of Typhon is that there is, what's implied is a kind of racial cuckoldry, especially if other myths are saying that Saturn or Kronos is the father.
Mhm.
So it suggests a kind of racial cuckoldry, and that would also be suggested in the case of uh, Vulcan or Hephaestus as well, right?
Right.
Um, and but the idea there too is that it's a kind of act of revenge against Jupiter, who famously is, you know, has all kinds of nymphs and oreads that he's knocking up and producing children from,
He's a
right?
bit of a player, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But and and even that is something that we can look at and be, well, I mean, it's not uh I because if we look at that, for example, we say, well, okay, well, who are some of the children that Jupiter are having? Some of the children are Bacchus. Some of the children are Mercury, who's a kind of we could say is a kind of attenuated or more mitigated form of Bacchus, not quite as bad, but having some of his sort of he's the deceiver. I mean, Mercury is the deceiver, and both are kind of clear proto-Jewish figures ultimately. So, and those are the children of Jupiter through some of his dalliances with these nymphs, or lesser deities or mortals. So there's a kind of lesson there as well, right?
Yeah.
But we only receive that lesson if we understand the significance of these other symbols and other gods, right? So if we're ignorant of this understanding, then we might look at that myth and be like, oh yeah, Jupiter was a ladies' man and was getting a lot of women, and that's, so we should imitate that. That's something to emulate. Well, look, I mean, I think that we can use our common sense on this. I think that we understand that female sexual purity is of greater value than male sexual purity. I think that we can agree on that, and there's sort of biological and evolutionary reasons for that. And if we if we have the idea that men are sinful, as in if we have an Aryan concept according to Nietzsche that men are sinful as opposed to women, um, I think that that becomes a better way of looking at the world, at least in terms of like developing society and developing propaganda, where in some ways it is worse if women are not sexually pure or are less faithful than it is. There's greater consequence there than if men are that way. But nevertheless, I think that we can, your monogamy has been kind of the standard in Europe, um, you know, uh, for thousands of years, including among the Greeks and Romans. And these myths are of a kind of separate. These myths are not. Again, I think that there's a kind of subversive aspect often to these myths,
Hmm.
but the
Well,
demos of Greece and Rome were distinct, from the deities. Like, so they understood the deities as kind of sinful on some level in this way or in this regard. Anyways, please.
yeah, no, and I mean,
Wait, oh, please.
genetically, I mean, it's of course, obvious that, um, the female is more valuable in terms of reproduction. I mean, one pregnancy essentially takes a year and a half out of her life, which is obviously isn't the case with men. So if you are able to, impregnate, a different race or a different person, then that has a much more compounding effect than if a man was to do that, for example. So, and if we jump back into the story itself, is there anything to parse out there? I mean, first we have the Olympians. They're terrified and they're forced to flee, and they leave in kind of a reverse exodus almost. I guess they leave Olympia, and they go to Egypt, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as that part of the story, I don't really have a good reading, or I haven't necessarily decoded that part of the story. But I mean, from my perspective, I think that what's interesting about the myth of Typhon is that, well, Typhon, for one, Typhon is given a sort of specific location um, in the ancient world. He's understood as having been imprisoned or driven to Cilicia, right? So, and Cilicia is in Asia Minor. It's sort of on the kind of southern. A southern eastern point, like the kind of southernmost eastern point of the peninsula down there. But so Typhon is imprisoned in Cilicia, and this is, I think that this is related. The capital of Cilicia is Tarsus.
Mhm.
Now, I argue, and I think that uh, some of the mythographers seem to support this point, if in a kind of indirect way. But I understand. I argue that Tarsus may have a connection to Tartarus, right? So an etymological connection to Tartarus. So
Right.
Tarsus. This again. This is the capital of Cilicia. Cilicia is where Typhon is driven and imprisoned. Um, and so you could. I make the argument that so narratively it makes sense because in the myths uh, Typhon is imprisoned in Tartarus, but in ostensibly, in terms of the kind of mythic geography of the ancient world, he's not placed in Tartarus. He's placed in Tarsus, or he's placed in Cilicia, right?
Right.
And Tarsus being the capital. So Tartarus may be a kind of poetic name for Tarsus. I argue that might have been intended by Homer. Uh,
And an interesting side note to that, of course, is who came out of Tarsus, right? Saul, otherwise known as Paul.
Yeah, no, Tarsus, and it actually says in the New Testament, it says of Tarsus that it's a kind of fascinating or unique, like it says kind of cryptically that like it's no ordinary city, right? It says of Tarsus, right? And
Yeah.
the truth is, Tarsus was no ordinary city because Tarsus, or at least Cilicia generally, was known for pirates in the ancient world, right? That's where all the pirates were hanging out, and they were giving, Greece and ultimately Rome a really Rome ultimately kind of came to a solution. Piracy was sort of rampant in the Mediterranean uh, world, in the ancient Mediterranean world. And in fact, in ancient Greece, around the time of Homer, it wasn't even necessarily considered ignoble to be a pirate. Like that was a kind of a legitimate career that a person could be involved in, right? But it was really in the Roman period where they started to like control piracy in the ancient world. That the Romans in particular really made the Mediterranean kind of a safe sea because they basically suppressed all the piracy in the Mediterranean. And in the reason this is relevant, and the reason that and it becomes another clue that Typhon is, well, Typhon, and I also make the argument that this is kind of like Typhon. Uh, so I make the argument that the idea that Typhon is driven to Cilicia means that we see what's being described as a kind of proto-Jewish exile or a driving of proto-Jews to some part of the world. It's very similar to when um, uh, the I've been calling them the Pelesians, but I think that the better pronunciation might be the uh, Pelas, Pelas, Pelagians. I don't. I'll go with Pelesians. But this is the pre-Hellenic group. The pre-Hellenic group, um, but they were, and I argued that there was a strong kind of proto-Jewish element among this uh, Pelesian group, which is proto-Hellenic, and they basically at some point they are exiled, right? Or some part of this group is exiled by the Athenians, according to Herodotus. Now
Right.
there's a distinction. There's a distinction to be made between the Pelesians, the literary Pelesians, and a kind of hypothetical archaeological category called the Pelesians, which are and I think that the literary uh, version of the Pelesians is kind of more instructive to what I'm describing. Whereas the archaeological one is more vague and is something that archaeologists are trying to piece together. So we're talking about the Pelesians from a kind of literary mythic perspective. But the Pelesians were driven from Athens by the Athenians to Lemnos, and it was in Lemnos that they established the cult of Vulcan or Hephaestus, right? And Vulcan is a kind of primary Pelesian god that they developed, a pre-Hellenic god. Vulcan or Hephaestus is a pre-Hellenic god. So I make the argument the same thing is happening with Typhon, that he's being driven to Cilicia. So that indicates a kind of that these proto Jews have been driven to Asia Minor, this southern eastern part of Asia Minor, and so that becomes a kind of proto Jewish inhabitation, and Tarsus becomes the capital of that of that group and of that city and of that sort of what will become an important sort of hub of commerce and but also of piracy, right? It becomes famous for piracy, and I argue that there is this becomes more evidence though that we're dealing with proto Jews, right? So we we understand that this group is also related to the Hyksos, right? So that's and the Hyksos have been identified with the sea people or these sea raiders and this sort of thing. So
Mhm.
we may also be talking about sea people or the same category of people here. Is one argument to be made or one speculation that we can have. But that piracy is actually kind of is part of Jewish history, right? So we're no longer talking about proto Jews, but we're talking about Jews. And one example of this would be when the Jews were kicked out of Spain, right, in the 1400s. They
Mhm.
became pirates, effectively. They became pirates in the Mediterranean. For hundreds of years, they became pirates. One of the main sort of pirate coves or pirate hubs where Jewish pirates now they not that pirates are usually a kind of motley crew, a kind of eclectic group, a bunch of drifters or whoever can be kind of pulled together to be involved in crime. But the sort of the navigators and the captains were often Jews, and were these sort of famous Jews that were pirates. And one of the main centers of activities, or one of their hideouts, or center, or sort of central areas of gathering and organizing their pirate raids was Jamaica. Right. This was
Mhm.
this is well known that so Jews dominated the piracy or the trade of piracy for hundreds of years, starting in the late 15th century. And going through that whole sort of golden age of piracy, I guess into the 1800s, or rather into the 18th century.
Right.
Um, so so we know that this. So in other words, what it tells us is that if Jews are kind of deprived a sort of normal way of like accessing what they want, they'll revert to other means, right? In some cases, criminal means. I mean, there's the Jewish mafia also was a kind of thing in the early 1900s, for example, right? So
Yeah, it's almost an extension of sort of their kind of default operating business as it is. I mean, it's heavily based on transporting goods and services from one area to another and acting as go-between. So, yeah, anything on the sea in general, piracy as well, would just be an extension of that, right?
yeah, so in the Cilician pirates were in. I don't know if I made this point already, but the Cilician pirates were the dominant pirate. Like that became a kind of synonym for pirates generally. So when the Romans put down the pirates, they were putting down the Cilician pirates, and that main hub was in Asia Minor, right, the home of Typhon, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and so the Romans were putting that down, and famously, um, but the Jews were also engaged in this. So there was known piracy coming out of Judea at the time as well, and during this push or this effort for the Romans to put down piracy in the Mediterranean, which was led especially by Pompey. Pompey, when he was during this whole campaign, when he was putting down the pirates in the Mediterranean, he led a campaign against Judea, and he put down Judea as well, right?
Right.
And and uh, and so so there's connections there, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing of about Tarsus as well is Tarsus apparently, people believe that the cult of Mithra ultimately comes out of, or Mithras comes out of Tarsus, right? So in Mithra, we can understand as a god that is in many ways very similar to Jesus, right? There's a lot of kind of similarities between the two cults. Now they're different in important ways. That's true, right? And they kind of appealed to different groups in Rome. Mithra appealed more to like soldiers and merchants and a kind of middle class group, you could argue, but also slaves. It also appealed to slaves. But you could argue it has a kind of more masculine aspect to it. But it was also a mystery cult and had similarities in the figure of Mithra, has similarities to Jesus, right?
Right.
Um, but you could argue that Christianity and Mithra both in Mithraism both came out of Cilicia. I mean, you could make that argument, right? In so Cilicia, Tarsus becomes an important hub. It was known as having great schools for rhetoric. So it is possible to have the thesis that both Christianity, through Paul in particular, and Mithraism comes out of Cilicia. And the other thing too is that Plutarch says that the Cilician pirates, practiced Mithraism, right? So they were worshiping Mithra, the
Right.
pirates, and so Mithra becomes another, what I would say is another kind of proto-Jewish religion, or even a kind of crypto Jewish religion at some point, depending on what that timeline looks like. Um, yeah, I mean, those are kind of the main points that I was going to make, that I think that we should find interesting. Is that Cilicia? I mean, and just to sum up, is that Cilicia appears to be a kind of important place of proto-Jewish inhabitation. It also becomes the it becomes kind of ground zero or the headquarters for a lot of piracy that was going on in the ancient world. And we also know that later Jews would be involved in piracy, when they get kicked out of Spain. So that it's a kind of mode that they can go into. And
And it's, piracy. I mean, it's a very transnational endeavor, right? Which again is, is kind of a forerunner to a lot of the stuff that came after.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. It's not a, it
It's not a
makes
huge.
Oh, please.
No, I was just saying it's not. It's yeah, it fits together really well.
Yeah, and it's not like in some ways we can look at it and say, I mean, we can say it's kind of kick ass on some level, like that they were just like, fuck it, we can't. We've been excluded by one means of dominance, so we have to revert to another criminal means, right?
Right.
So there are ideas that we're going to win one way or another, and there's something that you can admire about that, right?
Yeah.
And during the after they had been kicked out of Spain, though, they were especially allying themselves with Muslims, right? So a lot of the pirates were also Muslim, but there's a kind of Jewish direction or leadership
Well,
among them.
Turkish and the Ottoman Empire was obviously a big part of that, right? And the
Yeah,
Barbary coast.
yeah, and Jews have had this sort of relationship or connection or friendship with Muslims, especially as allies against the Europeans, and that's a kind of well documented thing. Now, of course, Jews would argue, well, it was because they were being oppressed by the Europeans, and the Europeans were unfair to them, and this sort of thing. But nevertheless, the reality remains that they were basically allying with Islam against the European world, right? But
Yeah.
in this example of piracy would be yet another example of that, because a lot of these pirates were also Muslims, but there's a kind of Jewish leadership to it, and the most famous pirates are ultimately these Jews, right? So I think with in and again, I don't think that you might even argue that Typhon, in a way, and this is just a kind of theory or possibility, that he might have been a kind of symbol for piracy on some level, right? Um, especially because we understand that that he's been imprisoned in Cilicia, and the Cilician pirates are dominating, the Mediterranean world, and that piracy is a kind of dominant element in the Mediterranean world or in the Mediterranean Sea, really until the Romans come around, right? Um, so that Typhon, because he's this kind of sea god, a god of winds and sea storms, there might even be a metaphor that associates him with piracy on some level, like he's this terror on the high seas, as it were, right? That's one possibility.
Well,
Um,
I think that would also fit a lot with the description of him as well, right? I mean, 100 snake heads, that can imply that that there's a foothold in every port, kind of thing. Speaking multiple every I think he speaks every language in the world or something like that. So again, that just shows kind of a transnational quality to him, right?
yeah, and the other thing that I mentioned to you before the call, and this is something that I pointed out before on uh, the film. The film reviews that I've done with Richard is that there are references. Jewish filmmakers will make references to Typhon, suggesting him as a proto-Jewish figure, exactly as I described him in their films. And one example of that would be Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? So Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Ark is located in something called the Well of Souls, right? But it's buried in this city, this lost Egyptian city called Tanis. And Tanis was the seat of the Hyksos, right? So this proto-Jewish group I was describing before, the Hyksos worshipped Seth-Typhon. So they were worshiping Typhon, right? Uh, this sort of proto-Jewish group. So Tanis is the seat of it, and I argued that Tanis there might be a kind of etymological connection between Tanis and this Hebrew word I described before, Tana, which means dragon or jackal, right? That
Right.
there could be a kind of etymological link there. But in any case, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones descends into the Well of Souls, and in there you actually see the jackal-headed god of uh, presumably who's Set or Seth, and then you also see serpents in there as well, right? You remember how Indiana Jones says, "I hate snakes." Those famous lines.
Yeah.
Those serpents also, and they're like hundreds of serpents, very similar to a description of Typhon, as you pointed out, right? So there are hundreds of serpents in there, and so the jackal is associated with the serpent in that scene as well, right? And they're understood as protecting the ark, so they have possession of the ark, right? So in a way, he's descending among Yahweh
Right.
and Satan or whatever, right? So in other words, these are Seth or Set is a proto form in some ways of Yahweh, and you could argue the serpents are a kind of proto form of Satan, but it's all kind of mixed in. I would argue as well, but in fact, though, in Egypt there are deities in one important one that has the same name as Yahweh. There's a deity named Yah, and Yahweh is referred to by Yah 50 times in the Hebrew Bible, right? So there's a moon deity that has the identical name as Yahweh, and we might guess that that is another example of a kind of proto-Jewish deity. You know, especially and Jews definitely can be connected vis-a-vis Aryans, who we would connect to the diurnal and the solar. Jews can be connected with the lunar and nocturnal. So this
Right.
moon god Yah would be one example. Who seems like he might even be the etymological root ultimately of Yahweh. I mean, an argument could be made for that certainly.
Yeah.
Um, in any case, I forgot what. I
Well, I was gonna ask. I mean, we're getting into the, I guess, our home stretch here, but what would you say is the essential message that that myth is trying to communicate?
the myth of Typhon.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's describing basically an ethnic conflict
Yeah.
ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So it's describing a conflict ultimately. I mean, not to between Aryans and Semites, but proto Jews in particular, right? So it's describing an ethnic conflict. I mean, I think that that is essentially the most important takeaway. And I guess the other takeaway from there is that Typhon is evidently an adversary and is depicted as an adversary in the ancient world. And Jupiter is the hero of that story, of course, right? And is a Jupiter represents order, um,
And it's interesting too
light,
that Typhon sort of,
day,
um, sorry, that Typhon incapacitates Jupiter by severing all his tendons. So just effectively making him, not killing him. He can't kill him, right? But he removes his strength. Like he eliminates his strength.
yeah. I mean, that's an interesting. And I looked at that and I wasn't like entirely sure what to make of it. And I mean, because it is kind of like you could, and I think that this might be kind of a stretch or it might be kind of a reach.
Yeah.
Um, but that you could make the argument that um, I mean it's strangely kind of interestingly similar to the fact that like you could say that the flesh represents the blood or the kin. You could make that argument. Now maybe this is a stretch. I would have to look at the myth in a kind of closer way. But this does seem like a kind of way for Jews to deal with us, especially through Christianity, you could say. But there is a desire to kind of separate us from our flesh, our blood, right? From our kin, or in the Greek would be sarx, which means both flesh and kin or blood, kinship.
Yeah.
Um, so
I
maybe it's a
took that.
metaphor for that. I don't know, but I would have to look at it closer. I mean, it could just be more of a what I mean.
Yeah.
Anyways, you were going to
My,
say.
my my basic take on that is just that the idea is just to eliminate physical vitality and strength from the Aryan as their primary movement, or it's like the primary threat, I guess, is just a physical vitality, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that that would be a kind of easier argument to make. So, in other words, I think I'm understanding your argument correctly that he's eliminating the kind of physical and martial aspect of the Aryan
Yeah.
uh, to achieve dominance over him, right?
Yeah. Especially the martial aspect.
The physical. yeah, it's sort of the and and I guess it could take different forms. It could be the economic versus the military or that sort of thing, but not avoiding the physical confrontation, if that fits.
Yeah, and your tendons are essentially your connective tissue. So, in a sense, you're dividing the body from itself, right? Or separating it from itself.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of interesting or funny and kind of grotesque thing about the myth is that I guess Typhon it manages. My memory of the myth is that Typhon manages to take all these Sinuans and like hide them in a cave or something in Cilicia, which but nevertheless Jupiter survives because he's an immortal, right?
Yeah.
And is able to regain and sort of reconstitute as a consequence. But yeah, I mean it's very interesting stuff. I mean the other place where uh, references to Typhon emerge are in the movie Rosemary's Baby, and also references to Tanis, right? So you remember that story at all? I mean, the general premise is that Rosemary is being basically inducted into a cult and being prepped to be the mother of Satan, right? And
Right.
and the people that are doing it are kind of cryptically seem to be indicated as Jews, and it's a little more complex than that, but that's basically what's going on. And they're getting her husband to basically be a cock and allow Satan to like impregnate his wife. But the sort of the rape scene where, or the impregnation scene where Satan is able to inseminate um, Rosemary is this very kind of abstract dream sequence where the name Typhon seems to be evoked apparently because it seems to there's a sequence before the rape sequence that's out on the water
Hmm.
on a boat, and there's like a ship crewman shouting "Typhoon, Typhoon!" Right, and so which is a reference in my mind to Typhon, and there are other clues in the movie that would point to this. Uh, so and then directly following that, she's raped by a reptilian devil, right?
Yeah.
And and I think it probably there could even be etymological connections between Set and Satan as well. But I think that more the connection that Roman Polanski is making is that he's equating Satan, or at least his sort of serpentine being, who is raping this Aryan woman with Typhon, right? He's equating with Typhon. And one
Right.
clue that points to that is that Rosemary is given a kind of she's given this this draught that she's supposed to drink. That's supposed to prepare her pregnancy. You know what I mean? To make sure
Yeah. Yeah. The old lady, the neighbor, gives her that, right?
yeah, yeah, and it's called the name of it is Tanis fruit. Tanis fruit. So it's a reference to the to this Hyksos seat of power, where they were worshiping Seth-Typhon, right? So they
Oh
were
wow.
worshiping Seth-Typhon. So that becomes another clue that kind of corroborates this idea that really the devil in that story that's raping this Aryan woman is Typhon, right?
Huh.
Um, which is remarkable because Jews retain an understanding of these myths and their meaning, right? Whereas
Yeah.
we've lost an understanding of these myths and their meaning. And I would argue that part of the reason is because of Christianity. Christianity has formed a kind of lobotomy on us as so far as it concerns the myths, an understanding of the myths and the symbols. You know?
Yeah. Well, I think we have a just a almost an inherent tendency to sort of devalue the power of stories and narratives, soft power, if you will, in favor of hard power, right? And
Yeah,
I think they keep that.
I think you're right. I think the problem though is that Typhon cuts off the sinews of Jupiter and hides them in a cave, and then we're fucked, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, yeah, that does kind of tie together, doesn't it? And I mean, it makes sense, when you're when your civilization is so heavily geared towards engineering and weapons and battle, you're just going to focus more on those things, aren't you? And to the detriment of other things. And if you're in their situation and you're faced with, an overwhelming, stronger opponent, then you have to go to Plan B. of course, right? And then that's what they've effectively done.
Yeah, and I mean, Plan B can be many things. Plan B can be a focus on financial or economic domination. It can be a focus on symbol and religion or culture, a religion like a kind of religio cultural attack. Uh, it could be that, or it could be. I think it could also be crime in like piracy, for example, when you've sort of run out of options, or when you, as a kind of last resort. Because that's what we see in the ancient world. Um, and again, I think a typhon might be a symbol, in particular or especially, of a kind of Jewish piracy. And again, we can relate him to the sea people, or to raiding in the ancient world generally. Um, so it is fascinating, this figure of Typhon. He's and the Romans correctly sort of placed him as a kind of arch enemy of Jupiter. I think
Oh
son of
yeah.
Saturn. I mean, it all kind of fits into our broader understanding of Greco-Roman myth, at least from an REM perspective, where clearly Typhon is a proto-Jewish figure, and is even, and again, the remarkable thing is that Jews understand this and we don't, right? And there and the evidence that they understand it, or contemporary Jews understand it, is that they will put references like this in films like Rosemary's Baby, or Raiders of the Lost Ark, because their understanding of the language is more, their understanding of the symbol language is more sophisticated than our own.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it essentially it supports the historic arc of events as well. You have an initial inhabitants, and then an Aryan movement into an area, where they've essentially usurped and taken over an area and are proven to be much stronger, a much more vital people. And so then there's an attempt, of course, to take that back, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So someone, I'll just answer one question that came up in the chat.
Sure.
So someone asked, doesn't the ocean usually mean Aryan? He goes on, the four beasts in Revelation arise from the sea and mean Aryan Empire. Well, I mean, it's something that I would have to look at a little closer, and I don't have time to get into right now. But as to um, the general question is, the ocean does not represent Aryans generally, but I don't think that it's necessarily. I think my understanding of the symbols, or this is sort of the conclusion that I've come to, is that things that are not areable, like deserts, salt, these become essentially kind of Semitic symbols. But water itself, fresh water, has an Aryan significance. Um, so salt water might suggest a kind of Semitization, if you will.
Right.
One example, or kind of the most famous example, is Venus emerging from the ocean. Um, I you're getting a you may want to mute on your side, while I'm answering. Yeah, I don't know how salient that's going to be in the broadcast. We apologize if that was as loud as it was to me, but hopefully it's fine. But and we'll deal with that in future broadcasts. But yeah, so Venus becomes a figure who emerges from the ocean, right? So there's this famous scene of Venus, the birth of Venus. She comes out of the ocean, and this was a scene that was depicted all over the ancient world. But the uh, but the kind of background to that story is that she's being cut from the Aryan sky god Uranus, right? So, and she's being cut, and she's actually, in her original form, she's his testicles or his genitalia, and the genitalia fall into the ocean and become Venus, and Venus emerges out of the ocean. So, and Venus herself, her name, well, especially Aphrodite, the name Aphrodite, and she is an Aryan goddess. I think that there's no question. Now, does that mean that she created? Was she first envisioned by Aryans? That's a separate question. That's a different question. But as a figure, she's a kind of Aryan goddess. I think that that's very clear. Goddess of beauty. But she, but her birth out of the ocean is kind of representative in some ways, of course, of her separation from this Aryan father or this Aryan male figure. So in that way, salt, you could argue, has a kind of Semitic significance. Salt in the ocean, this sort of thing, and because she is divided or cut from this Aryan figure of Uranus um, by Cronus or Saturn, of course, who is a you know, if you've listened to any of my ideas before or have read any of my work, you know that Saturn is a kind of preeminent proto-Jewish figure. So it represents a kind of liberation of the Aryan woman, liberation with quotation marks around it. And Aphrodite, the name Aphrodite, though, there's some. I think the etymology it might be sea foam. It might derive from words meaning sea foam. So she's connected to the ocean, but she's connected to the ocean in a way that suggests that she is in some sense fallen. She's no longer uh, Venus Urana, she's Venus Pandemos. Pandemos means of all people and suggests kind of promiscuity, right? So I think that the ocean has a significance that is, the ocean is it represents in the ancient world, it represents a realm between the underworld, the chthonic underworld, which has a clear kind of Semitic association. I mean, we just made the argument in this podcast that uh, Tartarus might even be a kind of reference in particular to a proto Jewish kind of inhabitation or area or headquarters down in Cilicia. Um, so, so it's somewhere between the earth and the underworld, and it's often seen as a kind of conduit to the underworld. People to go to the underworld in the ancient world, people had to either descend into lakes or into seas, or to cross oceans to get to the underworld or afterworld. So I think it has a kind of Semitic association. I would make that argument, and in those cases, the afterworld is a realm that's ruled by Saturn or Kronos, so a kind of proto-Jewish god, and or the way to it is through following cults, personal salvation cults, dedicated to gods like Bacchus or Dionysus, who are gods of personal salvation, much like Jesus Christ, right? So, yeah. So, I mean, that's the significance of that's if that gives you an idea of my thinking about the ocean as a symbol in this ancient myth and symbol language. That's my sort of analysis of it. Rick, you can unmute though.
Okay. I would say, I mean, I think we could probably agree. Well, maybe you wouldn't agree. I don't know. Neptune is somewhat ambiguous in that, he could be seen as a real Aryan god, and sometimes not, though, right? And I mean, when I think of Rome as land, and I think of Carthage as ocean, right? So, I mean, there's definitely, I think when it comes to the ocean, I think there's, like you said, there's a Semitic element to it, which matches, of course, up with pirates and a lot of the other stuff that we've seen as well, right?
Yeah. But I mean, Neptune, I agree, because I think that there is some suggestion that he might have originated as a freshwater god. Um, there's that. But sometimes he was equated with these gods that would ultimately be equated with Typhon, such as Yam is one god, an ancient Mesopotamian god. Um, so he is an ambiguous figure ultimately. I mean, I think with a guy like Jupiter, we can say Jupiter is our guy, but I think that Neptune may have a more liminal aspect to him. He might be somewhere in between. Um, but he's still a pretty cool god. I mean, he fathers some of the heroes, some of the important heroes as well, which doesn't support either argument necessarily. But Theseus is a descendant of Neptune, for example. Mercury, though, also is an important ancestor of many of the Greek gods, and he's definitely a kind of proto-Jewish Semitic god. Odysseus would be a famous example. Jason would be a famous example. Um, you know, but Hercules is a direct descendant of Jupiter, but his mother is, I forgot the name of it, but she's described as kind of dark-eyed, and her lineage, there are elements to her lineage that give us reason to believe ultimately that he's a kind of a proto-Jewish figure himself. Ultimately, um,
Well, and the horse was an early symbol of Neptune, was he not? Was it not?
well, yeah, in horse, the horse is the gift that he gives to Athens, right? So Minerva gives the olive tree as her gift to Athens, and as a consequence, or this is how the myth describes it, they name the city after her, and they make her the patron goddess of Athens. Athena, Minerva is the patron goddess of Athens. But during that competition, or that vying for dominion, over Athens, Poseidon, Neptune says, he gives the horse as his gift, right? And but the horse, yeah, I would agree with you. I think that the horse is essentially kind of Aryan symbol. You know,
Yeah. Sorry
yeah,
about the noise. So I mean,
yeah, yeah. Horses
Poseidon
were
or Neptune.
sacrificed. What?
I was just going to say Poseidon or Neptune could have had just a much stronger identity as a god of movement or transportation or something more akin to those lines, and sort of evolved more towards an ocean god, right?
Yeah, I mean, what we could probably say about a lot of these gods, in using the example of Minerva as well, is that a lot of their value is gained from their relationship to Jupiter, and I would say also to Apollo. So if they can be seen as gods that are faithful to Jupiter and Apollo, then they take on a kind of more positive aspect. And I think that, for example, I think that you can say, looking at the myth of Minerva or Athena, you can say that there is a kind of subversive suggestion there. In some ways, she's a kind of proto-feminist god. She's midwifed into existence by Vulcan, who takes an axe, and Vulcan is a Pelesian proto-Semitic god who cuts open the head of Jupiter and releases Athena or Minerva into the world, births her. So there is something kind of subversive with that story. Yet, nevertheless, Minerva or Athena has these kind of positive aspects, and she will become understood in the myth and in the religion as a kind of loyal daughter of Jupiter, and that has value, right? So she's a type who, evidently she indicates a certain type of woman, a kind of archetype of a type of female who's intelligent, maybe sort of atypical in some ways from other females in the sense that she's more oriented toward masculine things, including warfare. But she's nevertheless seen as a loyal daughter of Jupiter, which is positive. And other deities also gain a sort of positivity, including figures like Vulcan and Mercury, if they're understood as servants of Jupiter, which they are in various myths. I mean, Vulcan has a record of defying and being recalcitrant toward Jupiter, and then suffering the consequences, being cast out of Olympus because of it. But there are also examples of him being loyal to Jupiter, where he's forging the lightning bolts. And this is also the case with Mercury, who becomes the herald of Jupiter. But nevertheless, they have to kind of be recognized for what they are. I think that they can take on positive aspects, but key to this is an understanding of hierarchy, right? So, key to this is the understanding that Jupiter is the god; he is the highest god, or he's the king of gods. Apollo is the prince of gods, and he's next to Jupiter, the most important god. The Greeks understood this especially. Um, and also represents the founder. He's the founder of the civilization. He's the Hyperborean who founds the civilization. So what's very important is sort of the preeminence of these gods and the recognizing these gods as a kind of nobility against these other gods that have more of a kind of chthonic character, and they may do good, but they're also kind of untrustworthy on some level. I mean, Mercury is literally known as the deceiver. um, so these are all things to kind of consider when you're thinking about the gods, that there's a hierarchy of gods, and at the top of the hierarchy are these celestial, solar, and Aryan gods that rule, and that the key is that their interests cannot be harmed or corrupted. The other gods, the chthonic gods, to the extent that they're included and not cast into Tartarus or are punished, they have to be subservient to the celestial goals of these ancestral Aryan figures that are at the top of this hierarchy. Anyways.
So I'd say we got to keep the pantheon, keep the line up tight, right?
Yeah.
Not let these other elements in.
Well, they're not. I think that we have to respect them and recognize them as adversarial, essentially, but also realize the kind of genius that exists among them, and learn from that genius and develop it in our to our own ends, to fortify and protect ourselves. Right? There's the idea of the aegis that Jupiter wears that has Medusa's head on it, right? Now, exactly what that myth means, or exactly what that symbolizes, is we can speculate, but it may represent using kind of chthonic power against enemies, right? Or the ability to use chthonic power against enemies. Um, but in any case, yeah, I think that one gift that Mercury has, is that he is a genius when it comes to the development of religio culture. He's a symbolist, and we have to learn from that. And part of that process is developing our own religion that we originate and that we create in a symbol-wise manner that's symbolically coherent, and it becomes a kind of what's the word? It becomes a stronghold for us to inhabit. It becomes a place of protection, a sanctuary for us that defends us against others. Um, and I think that, but part of like developing this sort of magic ward, as it were, or this magic form of protection, is through an understanding of these symbols, in being able to read myth and understand if it's subversive or healthy, salubrious, and then, and most importantly, of course, is being able to develop our own myth, that is symbolically coherent and salubrious and healthy, and those sort of things. But yeah, I think that the reason that uh, we recognize Bacchus and Mercury as gods is because they are potent forces in the world, that have shown their power to kind of subvert us and dominate us. So in this way, we can understand them as gods and we can respect them. But they don't. Yeah, they shouldn't be on Olympus, and they were. Olympus is for our ancestors and for our gods, those who are for us and who are beneficial to us. Though, so we reserve Olympus for them, and these chthonic deities we expel from Olympus, just as Jupiter expelled Vulcan. We cast them out of Olympus, and but again, we don't underestimate them, but we don't follow them. That's the key. We don't follow them, right?
Here, here. Yeah, it's almost like developing an immune system, essentially, like a cultural immune system, right?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect metaphor.
All
What
right.
do you think?
Well, is that? Were there any other questions or anything else you wanted to cover before we sign off?
Yeah, I don't see anything else in the chat here. So
Awesome. All right. On
and
that note, then I will say onward and upward.
excellent. Yeah, and please like and subscribe. I guess that helps channels. I hear people say that a lot. So we'll talk soon, Rick.
Okay.
Bye bye.